This is the story of the COPO Camaro, a car so fast, so dominant, and so deliberately hidden from the world that it forced an entire sport to rewrite its rulebook. In 1969, a handful of determined drag racers and one very clever Chevrolet dealer figured out how to exploit a loophole in General Motors' own bureaucracy. And in doing so, they created one of the most legendary muscle cars ever built. Along the way, we will encounter corporate deception, backroom deals, engines that should never have existed, and a machine that was effectively banned from competition because nobody could beat it. So, let us begin. But first, what exactly was this corporate racing ban that made such elaborate scheming necessary in the first place? To understand the COPO Camaro, you have to understand what General Motors was like in the late 1960s. By that point, GM was the largest corporation in the world. Not just the largest car company, the largest corporation, period. And when you're that big, you attract attention. The wrong kind of attention, congressional hearings, safety investigations, public scrutiny about whether your products were killing people on American highways. In 1963, General Motors made a decision that would infuriate performance enthusiasts for years to come. They announced a corporate-wide ban on factory-sponsored racing. No more official involvement in NASCAR, no more drag racing programs, no more using motorsport to sell cars. The stated reason was safety concerns and a desire to promote responsible driving. The real reason, as you can imagine, was public relations. GM didn't want headlines about their cars going 200 miles per hour when Ralph Nader was writing books about how dangerous automobiles were. But here's where it gets interesting. The ban didn't just stop GM from racing. It also restricted what kind of engines they could put in their cars. Specifically, no GM division could install an engine larger than 400 cubic inches in any intermediate or pony car. The Camaro was a pony car, and that meant the biggest engine you could get from the factory was a 396 cubic inch V8. Now, 396 cubic inches is not small. That's a lot of engine. But in the world of drag racing, it wasn't enough. The competition, particularly Ford and Chrysler, were stuffing massive engines into their cars. The 426 Hemi, the 427 Fairlane. These were purpose-built drag racing weapons, and Chevrolet enthusiasts were getting embarrassed at the strip. I mention this because the frustration among Chevy loyalists was real and growing. They had the technology. Chevrolet made the legendary 427 cubic inch big block, one of the finest racing engines ever designed. They just weren't allowed to put it in a Camaro. The engine existed. The car existed. Corporate policy said they couldn't meet. Enter a man named Don Yenko. Don Yenko was a Chevrolet dealer in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, and he was not a patient man when it came to going fast. He'd been a successful sports car racer in the early 60s, and he understood something fundamental about the American car market. People wanted power, and they would pay for it. Yenko had already made a name for himself by taking regular Camaros off the lot and installing 427 engines himself, creating what became known as Yenko Super Camaros. These cars were monsters. They dominated local drag strips and developed a cult following. But there was a problem. Converting cars one at a time was expensive and time-consuming. Yenko's mechanics had to remove the factory engine, install the 427, upgrade the suspension, strengthen the transmission, and modify countless other components. Each conversion took hours of labor, and that meant each car cost significantly more than it should have. Yenko knew there had to be a better way. What he needed was for Chevrolet to build these cars at the factory, with the 427 already installed. With all the necessary supporting modifications done on the assembly line, where it was efficient, where it was cheap, where it could be done in volume, there was just one small obstacle. The corporate racing ban made that completely impossible, or so everyone thought. This is where we need to talk about COPO. Those 4 letters would become legendary among muscle car enthusiasts, but in 1968, most people had never heard of them. COPO stood for Central Office Production Order, and it was essentially a special ordering system within General Motors. The idea was simple. If a fleet customer needed cars with unusual specifications, they could submit a COPO request, and GM would build exactly what they needed. Think about it from GM's perspective. A taxi company might need cars with heavy-duty cooling systems for stop-and-go city driving. A police department might need upgraded suspensions and more powerful engines for pursuit vehicles. A rental company might want a specific combination of options that wasn't available on the regular order form. COPO existed to handle these special requests. It was bureaucratic, unglamorous, and almost entirely unknown to the general public. The key detail, the detail that would change everything, was that COPO orders bypassed the normal division-level approval process. A COPO request went through the central office, not through Chevrolet division management. And the people at the central office didn't necessarily know about or enforce the racing ban. They just processed orders. Don Yenko saw the loophole. If he could convince someone at GM to approve a COPO order for Camaros with factory-installed 427 engines, the racing ban would effectively become meaningless. The cars would be built on the same assembly line as regular Camaros. They would have factory warranties. They would have VIN numbers that identified them as legitimate production vehicles. And most importantly, for drag racing purposes, they would be legal for NHRA stock classes because they were factory-built automobiles. But convincing GM to do this would require help from the inside. Yenko found his ally in a man named Vince Piggins. If you're enjoying this story, by the way, consider subscribing. It helps us reach more people who love this kind of automotive history. But anyway, back to Piggins. Vince Piggins was a product promotion engineer at Chevrolet, and he was a racer at heart. His job officially involved promoting Chevrolet products, but unofficially, he spent a lot of time figuring out how to help performance enthusiasts get what they wanted, despite the corporate restrictions. Piggins understood the COPO system intimately, and he understood something else: the wording of the racing ban. The ban prohibited factory sponsorship of racing and restricted engine sizes in production cars, but it didn't explicitly prohibit selling cars to private individuals who happened to use them for racing. It didn't prohibit processing legitimate fleet orders through the COPO system, and it didn't prohibit Chevrolet from building a car that was technically street legal, even if everyone involved knew perfectly well it would never see a public road. There was room to maneuver. Piggins and Yenko just had to be careful about how they maneuvered. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Yenko would place a large order for Camaros through the COPO system. The order would specify a particular engine, the L72 427, which was Chevrolet's solid-lifter big block rated at 425 horsepower. In reality, that 425 horsepower figure was a lie. The engine made well over 450 horsepower, possibly closer to 500, but GM deliberately underrated it for insurance purposes. At any rate, the COPO order would also specify heavy-duty components throughout, things like upgraded transmissions, posit traction rear axles, and stronger suspension pieces. The genius was in the paperwork. On paper, this looked like a legitimate fleet order from a Chevrolet dealer. There was no mention of racing, no mention of bypassing the corporate ban, just a dealer ordering cars with specific options. The fact that those options added up to a purpose-built drag racing weapon was, officially speaking, coincidental. In late 1968, the first COPO 9561 Camaros rolled off the assembly line, and they were absolutely terrifying. Let me paint a picture of what these cars were. Take a 1969 Camaro body, which already looked aggressive with its sculpted fenders and wide stance. Now drop in a 427 cubic inch V8 that was essentially a modified version of Chevrolet's racing engine. Pair it with a Muncie M22 Rock Crusher 4-speed transmission, named for the distinctive gear whine it produced. Add a 12-bolt rear axle with 4.10 gears, for maximum acceleration. Stiffen the suspension. Delete every piece of sound deadening and unnecessary weight you can remove. What you have is a factory-built race car with license plate brackets. The COPO Camaros were not comfortable. They were not quiet. They were not practical for anything resembling normal driving. The solid lifter engine had to be adjusted constantly. The aggressive cam made the engine idle roughly at stoplights. The steep rear axle gearing meant the engine was screaming at highway speeds. Nobody bought these cars because they wanted something nice to drive to work. They bought them because they were the fastest production cars Chevrolet had ever built. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting, because the 427 iron block COPO wasn't even the most extreme version. There was another COPO order, number 9560, that specified something even more exotic, an all-aluminum 427. This engine was designated the ZL1, and it was nothing short of engineering insanity. Chevrolet had developed it for their Can-Am racing program, where weight was everything. The block was aluminum. The heads were aluminum. The intake manifold was aluminum. The entire engine weighed about 200 pounds less than the iron block version, which might not sound like much until you realize that 200 pounds off the front of a drag car completely transforms how it launches. The ZL1 made around 430 horsepower, according to the official rating. Nobody believed that number for a second. In reality, these engines produced over 500 horsepower, with some claiming figures closer to 550 when properly tuned. For context, a standard Camaro SS made about 300 horsepower. The ZL1 was playing in an entirely different league. There was one significant problem with the ZL1: cost. The all-aluminum engine was hideously expensive to produce. When Chevrolet priced the ZL1 COPO Camaro, the engine alone cost more than many complete cars. A base model Camaro started around $2,700 in 1969. A ZL1-equipped COPO Camaro had a sticker price of approximately $7,200. That's nearly 3 times the cost of a normal car, and in 1969 dollars, that was absolutely staggering. To put that in perspective, you could buy a brand new Corvette for less money. You could buy a house in some parts of the country for not much more. The ZL1 Camaro was priced like an exotic European sports car, except instead of leather seats and sophisticated suspension, you got an unforgiving race car with rubber floor mats. Only 69 ZL1 Camaros were ever built. That's not a typo. 69 cars, total production. And the reason was simple economics. Hardly anyone could afford them. Dealers who ordered them often couldn't sell them, and some ended up pulling the engines out, selling them separately to racers, and putting regular 427s or even small blocks back in the cars to make them sellable. Those 69 cars are now among the most valuable muscle cars in existence. When one comes up for auction today, expect to pay well over $500,000. Some have sold for over $1 million, and that's for a car that was considered a hard sell when it was new. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about what happened when these cars actually hit the drag strips, because this is where the COPO Camaro went from being a clever workaround to becoming a genuine legend. The NHRA, which is the National Hot Rod Association, had rules about what classified as a stock car. The basic idea was that stock classes should feature cars as they came from the factory, with minimal modifications. This was supposed to keep competition fair and ensure that regular people could buy something similar to what they were watching race. The COPO Camaros were technically factory cars. They had factory VINs. They had factory warranties. They came directly off the assembly line at the Chevrolet plant in Norwood, Ohio, built alongside regular Camaros. By the letter of the rules, they were eligible for stock classes, but they absolutely demolished everything else in those classes. When the COPO Camaros started showing up at drag strips in early 1969, the results were almost comical. These cars were running quarter-mile times in the low 11-second range, which was supercar territory. For comparison, a typical muscle car of the era might run high 13s or low 14s if it was well tuned. The COPO Camaros were nearly 3 seconds faster, which in drag racing is an eternity. Dick Harrell, one of the most famous drag racers of the era, campaigned a ZL1 COPO Camaro with devastating effectiveness. Fred Gibb, another prominent racer and Chevrolet dealer who had been instrumental in getting the COPO program approved, ran his own ZL1 with similar results. These weren't just fast cars, they were embarrassing the competition so thoroughly that it threatened to kill interest in the stock classes entirely. The racing sanctioning bodies had a problem. The COPO Camaros were legal by the existing rules, but they were so much faster than everything else that races became predictable. If a COPO showed up, everyone else was racing for second place. That's not entertaining. That doesn't sell tickets or keep participants coming back. So the rules changed. The NHRA began implementing restrictions specifically designed to address the COPO situation. New minimum production requirements were established, mandating that a certain number of cars had to be built before a model could compete in stock classes. Weight penalties were added for certain engine configurations. The stock categories were restructured to separate the ultra-performance vehicles from more ordinary machinery. In effect, the COPO Camaro was regulated out of meaningful competition. It wasn't banned outright in most cases, but the rules were rewritten to ensure that these cars couldn't dominate in the way they had initially. I love this detail, by the way, because it illustrates just how successful the COPO program was. Chevrolet's engineers and the dealers who pushed for these cars wanted to win. They wanted to embarrass Ford and Chrysler at the drag strip, and they succeeded so completely that they broke the sport they were competing in. Think about that for a moment. The car was too good. It wasn't outlawed because it was unsafe or because it cheated. It was outlawed because letting it compete would have made racing boring. But the COPO story doesn't end with rule changes, because while the sanctioning bodies were scrambling to figure out what to do about these cars, the muscle car era itself was approaching its expiration date. By 1970, the forces that would kill American performance cars were already assembling. Insurance companies had figured out that young men driving high-powered cars were expensive to insure, and premiums were skyrocketing. The federal government was implementing emissions regulations that would make high-compression engines increasingly difficult to build. The first gas crisis was just a few years away, and fuel economy was about to become more important than horsepower. The COPO program continued in limited form for 1970 and 1971, but the cars produced were less extreme and far fewer were built. The window for this kind of automotive insanity was closing. General Motors, like all American manufacturers, was pivoting toward compliance with new regulations. The days of building barely disguised race cars with paper-thin justifications were ending. And what of the cars themselves? What happened to those original COPO Camaros? Many were raced until they were used up. Drag racing is hard on machinery, and cars that get run down the quarter mile repeatedly tend to wear out, crash, or get modified beyond recognition. Original, unmodified COPO Camaros became incredibly rare almost immediately because the people who bought them to race, not to preserve. Some were destroyed when owners couldn't sell them as complete cars. Remember those ZL1s that dealers couldn't move? Some of those got stripped, their valuable aluminum engines sold to racers, their bodies repurposed or scrapped. It seemed practical at the time. Nobody knew these would become million-dollar collector cars decades later. A small number survived intact, either through luck or because their owners recognized early that these were special machines. These survivors form the foundation of the COPO Camaro market today, where verified original examples command prices that would have seemed absurd to the people who built them. And what of Don Yenko, the man who started all this by wanting factory-built performance cars he could sell from his dealership? Yenko continued converting and selling high-performance Chevrolets throughout the muscle car era. He adapted when the era ended, shifting his business model as the market changed. He remained a respected figure in the Chevrolet performance community until his death in 1987 in a plane crash. The Yenko name still carries enormous weight among muscle car collectors, and his early COPO cars are considered the most desirable of all. Vince Piggins, the GM engineer who helped make the COPO program possible, continued working at Chevrolet until his retirement. He was instrumental in other performance programs over the years and remained beloved by enthusiasts for his willingness to find ways around corporate restrictions. He understood that people wanted to go fast, and he spent his career trying to help them do it within whatever bureaucratic constraints existed. The COPO designation itself has experienced a revival. In recent years, Chevrolet has offered modern COPO Camaros, factory-built drag racing specials that continue the tradition of the original cars. These modern versions are purpose-built race cars, not street-legal vehicles, and they're produced in limited numbers each year. It's Chevrolet acknowledging its heritage, recognizing that those original COPO cars represent something meaningful about what the company was capable of when motivated people found ways around the rules. Here's what makes the COPO Camaro story resonate, even now, more than 50 years later. It's a story about people who refused to accept limitations. General Motors said no more racing involvement. Dealers and engineers said, fine, we'll find another way. The rules said no engines over 400 cubic inches. The COPO system said, hold my beer. Every person involved in creating these cars knew what they were doing. They knew the corporate racing ban existed. They knew they were exploiting a loophole. They knew the cars they were building served no purpose other than going very fast in a straight line. And they did it anyway, because that's what their customers wanted. And because they believed those customers should have the option to buy the fastest car technology could produce. Was it a little shady? Maybe. The COPO system was designed for fleet orders, not for creating drag racing weapons. The people involved were clearly stretching the intent of the program far beyond what anyone originally envisioned. But they operated within the rules as written, even if they violated the spirit of those rules. There's something very American about that. Finding the loophole. Exploiting the gap between what's prohibited and what's merely discouraged. Building the thing everyone says you shouldn't build, and then winning so decisively that they have to change the rules to stop you. The COPO Camaro exists because a handful of people looked at a corporate ban on racing and asked themselves not whether they should circumvent it, but how. They succeeded so completely that their cars are legendary and their approach is still discussed whenever someone wants to understand the muscle car era. Make no mistake, these were not practical automobiles. They were temperamental, expensive, uncomfortable, and suited only for one very specific purpose. Nobody drove a ZL1 Camaro to get groceries. You couldn't have a conversation at highway speeds because the engine was too loud. The solid lifters needed constant adjustment. The aggressive gearing meant atrocious fuel economy. These were machines built for the drag strip and tolerable at best everywhere else. But that was the point. They weren't supposed to be practical. They were supposed to be fast, and at that task, they succeeded beyond anyone's reasonable expectations. When you look at a COPO Camaro today, whether in a museum or at an auction or in some lucky collector's garage, you're looking at a moment in time when automotive engineering met bureaucratic creativity and produced something magical. You're looking at what happens when people who love going fast refuse to accept that the rules say they can't. The corporate racing ban remained in place at GM for years, but for one brief moment, a few clever individuals found a way around it, and they built some of the most memorable cars in American history. Well, there we are. A car that was never supposed to exist, built through a loophole in corporate bureaucracy, so dominant that it forced the racing world to rewrite its rules, and now worth more than anyone involved could have imagined. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.